They say that a man's home is his castle. It is the one place on earth where you can lock the door and shut out the horrors of the world. But what do you do when the horror isn't outside? What do you do when you lock the front door and you realize you didn't lock the monster out? You locked yourself in with it. In 1986, the Andrews family lived in a quiet, two-story house in Pepperell, Massachusetts. It was a safe town, but inside the walls of that house, something was rotting. Something was watching. This is the story of Daniel LaPlante. And be warned, after you hear this, you will never look at the crawl space in your basement the same way again. To understand the terror, you have to understand the grief. Brian Andrews had just lost his wife to cancer. He was left alone to raise his two teenage daughters, Annie and Jessica. The house was filled with a heavy, suffocating sadness, and grief makes you vulnerable. When things started to go missing, they blamed their memory. When they heard a creak in the floorboards, they blamed the old house. It started innocently. Annie, the eldest, would be in her bedroom listening to music, and she would hear a tapping sound, tap, 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 coming from the wall behind her bed. Then, the haunting escalated. Furniture began to move on its own. The girls would come home to find the heavy armchair facing the wall. And one day, scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red marker, was a message. "I'm back," the girls screamed. They ran to their father. "It's Mom," they cried. "Mom is trying to talk to us." Desperate for a connection, they did what any grieving teenagers would do. They held a seance. I want you to imagine the scene. Late at night, the two sisters sitting on the floor, a Ouija board between them. "Mom," Annie whispered, "if you are here, knock once." Silence. And then, from inside the wall, right next to them, "Knock." The girls started crying tears of joy. They thought it was a miracle. They spent weeks talking to the walls. "Do you love us?" "Knock. Are you watching us?" "Knock." They didn't know it then, but they weren't talking to their mother. They were talking to a predator, a teenage boy named Daniel LaPlante, who was sitting in the hollow space between the studs, reading their diaries, learning their secrets, and laughing at their pain. But Daniel was getting arrogant. He wanted to be seen. One Tuesday night, Brian Andrews was downstairs locking up. He looked up the staircase. Standing at the top of the landing, in the shadows, was a figure. It was wearing his dead wife's clothes, her favorite dress, a long blonde wig, and it was holding a hatchet. Brian froze. By the time he blinked, the figure was gone, vanished. He grabbed a baseball bat and tore the house apart. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. There was no one there. Brian sat on his bed, shaking. Was he losing his mind? Or was this house truly possessed? Mid-roll break. Pause for 2 seconds. Before we get to the terrifying discovery inside the walls, I have a question. Have you ever heard a noise in your house and told yourself, it's just the wind? After this story, you might want to double-check. If you enjoy true horror documentaries, please hit the subscribe button. We explore the darkest corners of humanity every week. Now, back to the nightmare. Resume. The terror reached its breaking point in December. The girls were home, alone. Suddenly, the TV turned off. Then, the lights flickered and died. The house was plunged into darkness. From the hallway, they heard footsteps. Heavy, wet footsteps. Then, they saw him. Standing in the kitchen doorway was a nightmare. A tall, gaunt boy. He had painted his face with their makeup to look like a skull. He was wearing their mother's coat. and he was holding a hatchet. He didn't speak. He just smiled. The girls screamed and sprinted out the back door, running to the neighbor's house. They called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched everywhere. Under the beds, the attic, the basement, nothing. The house was empty. The police told Brian it was likely a hallucination caused by stress. But Brian knew. He sent the girls away and stayed in the house alone. He was going to catch this ghost. 2 days later, Brian walked into his bedroom and saw a shadow move. He turned around, and there was Daniel LaPlante, standing in the room, holding the hatchet. Brian didn't scream. He ran at him. Daniel was fast. He scrambled into the master bedroom closet. Brian chased him, blocking the door. "Where are you going to go now?" Brian yelled. But when Brian ripped the clothes aside, the closet was empty. Brian felt the wall, and then he found it. A small, almost invisible panel in the back of the closet that led to the plumbing crawl space behind the bathtub. He called the police. "He's in the walls. I found him." This time, the police brought tear gas. They surrounded the crawl space. "Come out," the sergeant ordered. Slowly, a panel in the hallway wall popped open. First, the hatchet slid out. Then, 2 hands. Then, the face. Daniel LaPlante emerged from the wall like a spider. He was covered in dust and insulation, still wearing the dead mother's clothes underneath his own. When they dragged him out, they found his lair. It was a narrow space between the walls. Inside, Daniel had built a nest. He had a sleeping bag. He had food wrappers from their kitchen. But the most terrifying thing they found were the peepholes. Daniel had drilled tiny holes into the drywall. One hole looked directly into the living room. One looked into the bathroom. And one hole looked directly into the girls' bedroom. He had been there for months. He had watched them sleep. He had watched them cry. He had been inches away from their heads, listening to them breathe. The Andrews family moved out the next day. They never returned. Because how could you? How could you ever sleep again, knowing that the walls might be looking back at you? So tonight, when you turn off the lights, listen. Is that creak just the floorboards? Or is there a panel in your closet that you've never noticed before? Because monsters don't always live under the bed. Sometimes they live inside the walls.